The other side of the war is personified by Ho Chi Minh. How do you view Ho Chi Minh after going through this project? What do we not understand about Ho Chi Minh?
Well, number one, as I said, it wasn't Ho Chi Minh running things. Early on, there's an amazing thing in the first episode where the OSS in 45 parachute into northern Vietnam. They meet the sickly head of the Viet Minh, who's declared independence from the French. He's dying. They save his life. They arm him to fight the Japanese. His name is Ho Chi Minh, and he says, wow, you guys are so fabulous. You never had an imperialist empire. I'm going to rename it the Viet American Army. And on September 2nd, and 1945, a lot of people know the importance of that date because out in Tokyo Bay on the USS Missouri, the formal surrender of the Japanese in the Second World took place. But in Ba Dinh Square, in a town, Hanoi, that Ho Chi Minh knew far less than he knew Paris, France, or London, or even New York or Boston, where he had worked as a pastry chef at the Parker House. After having tried to get President Wilson's attention in 1919 in Paris about a petition to think about Vietnamese independence, it didn't happen. Nobody showed it to Wilson. Nobody showed his letters to Truman. Nobody did any of that. He goes out in Ba Dinh Square and declares Vietnamese independence. And he says, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and standing next to him is an OSF officer. Within a month, within weeks, a US advisor, a OSS guy there, Peter Dewey, is killed accidentally by the Viet Minh, mistaking him for a Frenchman because, of course, all Westerners look alike. This is why it's called Deja Vu. And there's a big policy thing. The Cold War is happening. Truman's being blamed for losing China, and all these things are beginning to happen over the intervening years. And de Gaulle is throwing a tantrum and saying, if you don't help us restore our colony, I'm going to be forced to go into the Soviet orbit. And all of a sudden, we're no longer neutral. And so Ho Chi Minh is writing, please don't be distracted by this thing called communism. The Soviets were so suspicious of him. They saw him as a nationalist first and a communist second. So he's a very interesting figure and remains there until his death. But it's Le Duan who's calling the shots. And wouldn't you like to know that? I mean, if you're landing at D-Day, you don't think you're going after a guy named Himmler, only to find out 45 years later it's a guy named Hitler. Wouldn't you like to know that? And we have that tape of McNamara, maybe you've heard it, talking to Johnson about this guy, Le Duan. And it's amazing. And when General Giap, Tom is here, we talk about this all the time, who's met him and spoke with him. It's actually pronounced Zop, the hero of Dien Bien Phu. When he died at 104, the New York Times obit, quite correctly, started on the front page, full page inside, gave him credit for the Tet Offensive. He's so opposed, General Zop so opposed the Tet Offensive that his entire general staff was arrested by Le Duan, and General Zop was sent to Hungary for medical treatment. And Ho so opposed it that his secretary was arrested and he was sent to Beijing for medical treatment. Even though it was going to be Ho's poem read over the radio that was a signal to commanders all over the South to begin to go into position to start the raid, because he was the figurehead. But behind it is this guy named Le Duan. And so you'll meet him in episode 1 and he'll be there in every single episode from then on. And that's like a totally new character in a war we think we know, right?
You see very clearly the divisions in this country through this film. Some of us remember them, but it was dramatic. We now live, once again, in a divided America. What lessons can we learn from Vietnam America?
Well, I think what I suggested in my remarks, we do not mention any of this in the film. We're just trying to tell a story from beginning and middle and end, and then and then and then, is that the divisions that began then are the divisions we have today. They've just metastasized and grown. And so what if we could get back to an understanding of how they happened in this country through a variety of factors, And we don't have to blame the other. We can allow a thing and the opposite of a thing to be true at the same time, that we don't have to subscribe to conspiracy theories, or that there are Camelot people who say, well, you know, just if Kennedy had lived, he would have not gone into Vietnam. There is absolutely zero evidence that that is true. I mean, he inherited 600 or 700 advisors, military advisors from Eisenhower. There were 17,000 when he was murdered in Dallas, right? Johnson felt less self-assured about foreign policy and kept every single one of Kennedy's foreign policy apparatus, you know, McNamara and defense, Rusk at State, McGeorge Bundy, Maxwell Taylor, the whole slew of them. And they pushed and pushed and pushed. You know, LBJ said that foreigners aren't like the people that I know in America. And he was much more interested in being the reincarnation of his hero, FDR. He had an ambitious domestic agenda, which he was trying so hard. And one of the great tragedies of the Vietnam War, one of the many casualties of it, is LBJ's domestic problem. Because as the war becomes all-consuming and the budget is eaten up, it erodes the effectiveness and the ability to continue his great society, which is the continuation of the New Deal. And that's a tragedy. And then Nixon has its own stuff. So I think we are constantly beset by these little tropes that we have. Well, if this had happened, this wouldn't have happened. Last night somebody came up and said, how many prisoners of war do you think there still are in Vietnam? And I said, 0. 0. The Vietnamese have been working with us for more than 20 years, not just finding that, but our MIA, the remains, the remains, they're helping us do it. And they have 300,000 MIAs. People that they don't have any evidence of their presence or the lack of presence. This is an amazing thing. And while we were arguing over 500-600 POWs, the South Vietnam, our proxy government, and the CIA and others were managing somewhere between 30 and 40,000 prisoners in South Vietnam. So it's such a complicated Rashomon story. And the only thing is to do is sit back and say, yes, this is what happened. You can look at the return with great patriotic fervor, you know, and hear Ray Charles and just invest yourself. And I mean, this is why I really do hate showing clips, because if you'd seen the other 10 clips over 5 other episodes with Hal Kushner, you'd understand even more what it meant for him to be free.
What a climactic moment.
What a climactic moment it was for him.
This is 18 hours, as you mentioned. I think when we were in New Hampshire, it was to be 19 and a half hours. You whittled it down further. This is breathtaking in scope. Where do you start with a project like this? Where do you begin?
You know, you hit the nail on the head, Mark. It's the most terrifying thing. Where do you begin? And so that intro that you saw had been worked on and polished for longer than anything else. I think the intro was the last thing we fussed with, because it's always that first note in a piece of music, or the first chord or the first measure, that really determines its tenor, you know, the kind of almost PTSD anxiousness of these fragments of scenes and memories and dreams sort of coming up to consciousness, and then this incredible symmetry that an American Marine veteran can be friends with another couple. He and his wife can be friends with another couple for 12 years before the wives put it together that they've both been in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and they, good friends, hadn't said a word. And that he could ask that, and what happens at the end of that intro? You've got a North Vietnamese veteran. Karl Marlantes, by the way, is a writer who wrote a powerful novel called Matterhorn. Bao Ninh has written the Shadow of War. It's an amazingly beautiful book. Same thing, he was a grunt in the NVA. And he said the veterans don't talk about it. So we have the exact same thing. Americans are still divided. The Vietnamese, a great revelation to us, are still divided. They're arguing over, was the cost right? You know, 75% of their population was born after 1975. They're, have 80 million people now. They're going on. They're a very interesting, pragmatic kind of repressive regime. They've got an open market. They've got a pretty free internet, unlike China. It's not controlled, and they're moving on. And a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but a lot of the veterans are saying, was it worth the cost? Was it worth just, their calculus was they would not count the cost. We assumed we would erode their morale. They said, we will throw as many human beings at them as they can, and eventually they were tired. Fritz Hollings went down there, and Westmoreland bragged to him and said, hey, we're killing 10 of them to every one of us. And he said, my constituents only care about the one, Westy. And at some point, those ones add up to enough that Americans say, in Edward Alvarez's language, no mas.
We sit in the library of the 36th president, who 50 years ago this year created the National Broadcasting Act, signed the National Broadcasting Act into law, which created PBS. And we now are in a world where there's a very crowded media landscape and many vehicles for distribution. Why do you continue to go back to PBS?
I'm very good friends with the head of HBO. Really, he's a dear, dear friend, and he's been very helpful to us in fundraising and things like that. And I was at a dinner, and a person at that dinner asked that very question, like, Richard, why don't you have Ken? He said, we'd like to have him. And I said, but he wouldn't have spent 10 years letting me make Vietnam. And he said, no. There is only one place that could have happened. And that's true of every film I have made. And it was interesting, while I was making the Civil War, others would come out. After the success of the Civil War, people would come up and say, what are you doing next? I'd say, baseball. It's the sequel. And they kind of look, sequel? What are you talking about? You must be crazy. So it's a couple of hours. I said, it's actually 18 and a half hours. No one will watch it. So it had even higher viewership than the Civil War. And then after that, well, what are you doing? Well, we're doing a history of jazz. African-American stuff doesn't sell. And so, every single time, and it's the highest rated arts program on PBS. So every time you begin to realize that this place is willing to tolerate our process. And in this case, our process was to spend 10 years until we felt we could get it right, that we could get the facts right, that we could get all of the nuances all right, that we'd be able to see it from so many perspectives that it might be possible for the people that are sad, that are angry, that are tormented. There's a moment when we do a scene in our last episode on The Wall when our Marine, John Musgrave, goes there and he sits down and he sobs. He says, I suddenly realized, thank God, this is going to save lives. And I hope that in some ways that we could flatter ourselves that that our film could in some ways promote the kind of courageous conversations I think we could have to help the very divisions that your previous question was asking about. We have that possibility of returning to the kind of America that we know, that does things together, that knows that politics is always about getting the half loaf, not everything that you want, and not the ideological purity that seems to be, no, it's my way or the highway. I'm right, you're wrong. If nobody's right, if everybody's wrong, Buffalo Springfield, I keep coming back to that.
We were, last year, we hosted a Vietnam War Summit, and a year ago tonight, Ken Burns was here to share his film with us at that time. We were honored again to have him today. I don't have to commend this film to you. You've already seen it, and you can see how dramatic and compelling it is and how important it is. It will change the paradigm of Vietnam, the way we think about that war. What you mentioned PBS being a partner. I know Bank of America was a partner in this great project as well.